NSFW Redditors who lived in secluded towns. What's the darkest thing that has ever happened in your town that everyone knew about but never talked about? Suicides, mostly from non-local people. My town and surrounding area was, and to a point still is, a well-known area to hang oneself. Sometimes people would also commit suicide by either crashing their car or gassing themselves in their car. Local business owner killed his 18-year-old daughter and her stepmom with a hammer, then hung himself. No one ever found out why. Another local man down the road shot his family, dogs and horses, lit the house on fire, then shot himself. He provided the flowers to the local independent supermarket, and they found out he'd been fiddling the books and overcharging them massively for a long time. Everything went down a day or two after they told him that they knew and let him go. A girl I know texted the daughter on the following day saying, "I hope you're not dead," because she didn't show up to college. During the Korean War, the North Korean People's Army were getting closer to my town. The government forces rounded up hundreds of people they suspected of being communist or communist sympathizers, took them a little out of town and executed them. I had no idea this happened, and it's never talked about. Oddly enough, our part in the Korean War is celebrated because the North Koreans' advance was stopped at our town. The cleaner at my old primary school hung himself right in the middle of the hall where all the assemblies and such took place. Needless to say, school was cancelled for a few days. Odd, the janitor for my elementary school who lived beside us hung himself in our school utility closet. He and his wife couldn't have kids, so they would take my brother and I to the park a lot. My grandma said the wife wanted kids badly, so she filed for divorce, and in return he hung himself. It makes me horribly sad thinking about it. Not secluded, but I live in a small town. The owner of the pizza shop down the street from me shot himself in the head a couple of years ago, in broad daylight, behind the shop. Nobody talks about that. My town is not very small, but was fairly small when these events happened. In the 70s, a man had been kidnapping young girls about 10 years old and keeping them in a dungeon made from an old bunker below his garage. One 12-year-old girl was kept in his dungeon and raped for 6 months. The man actually aided in the search for one missing girl to try to mislead the police, although he was eventually caught when his wife grew suspicious. He was given life in prison. The first time I heard about this was from a YouTube video compiling similar cases. The video mentioned my town, and after a quick search I found out that the house was only about 300 meters from me, and I had passed it hundreds of times while walking to school. I get chills every time I think about it now. I suppose people don't mention it anymore because it happened 40 years ago, but my mom, who grew up only a little further up the street from this man, instantly knew what I was talking about when I asked her about it. Someone got murdered in this secluded rundown bar a few minutes down the road, and their body was dumped in the lake. Despite everyone usually knowing everything and everybody, nobody would speak of it. A guy living here was pretty well known in our community just because he socialized with everyone a lot. Anyway, sadly he was suicidal. He went up to the mall and shot himself with a shotgun. Now, we have 2 police officers in our village, and he was friends with them, so he put sticky notes all over his house, and some of them demanded that those officers were to not attend the scene. Some police from the nearest town were looking for his location, but didn't know the area, so they called the police from my village to show them where it may be. They hadn't been told what they were going to, so when they arrived and saw their dead friend, well, I can imagine it being a horrible sight. I used to live in remote Australia. A body of a girl about 17 to 18 turned up in the middle of nowhere. I mean nowhere. The nearest house was 40 km away. The road was red dirt. Some drovers found her nearly decomposed. No one knows who she is. No one knows where she came from. The only theory they have is that a river flooded and brought her down from Darwin, and she's more than likely an international tourist. We don't talk about it because there is literally no town and no one in it to talk about it to. One of the elementary school teachers was molesting kids. He went on a Wednesday night in March hunting trip with a bunch of the kids' dads. There was a terrible accident, and the teacher did not survive. The mandatory sheriff's investigation found no sign of foul play. About 9 years ago, a guy lost his job at a nearby Kaiser, so he killed his 5 children and wife, and then turned the gun on himself. Before he shot himself, he faxed a letter to a news station explaining that the tough economic times we were living in left him no other choice, and also apparently indicated that he and his wife had agreed to this murder-suicide pact weeks before it happened. They had pulled their older children out of school and everything. A girl at my high school went missing. Then about 2 months later, the paper ran a story about how a local girl was abducted, taken to Mexico, and gang raped, sodomized, and several other graphic details. That girl showed up at school. She was there about 5 minutes before everyone connected the dots, and she had to leave. It was sad as shoot at the time. It's even sadder now that I'm grown up and understand what happened. My small town paper is an asshole. 2 terrible things occurred. A very popular boy hung himself from a swing set in a town park. He was 17. At that time there had been a couple suicides of young boys in our area, but this one really took people by surprise. Funeral was terrible. He had one older brother and a sister. About 3 or 4 years later, the older brother hung himself at the same place on the anniversary of his brother's suicide. Terrible. My friend's 21 years old sister was murdered in her house on Christmas. Came home from celebrating with family to find someone robbing her house. He'd beaten, murdered her with a baseball bat. Ended up to be a kid she went to HS with. He ended up killing himself in jail. It's been 10 years and it's still difficult to talk about. Woman shot the guy that molested her son in the middle of the courtroom. Movie was made about it. Even bumped into the woman at the store a few times. Have never heard anyone mention it other than the paper occasionally. Somebody owned a pub and killed his wife and bricked her into the wall. She was reported missing. 30 years later they were renovating the pub and found her, but at that point her husband had died. Edit. I've left a link to the article I found. Thank you for the silver. Family up the road from me seemed like nice people, always friendly, owned a business within the area, everyone knew them. But they all seemed kind of off or strange. I don't want to use the term, but it was apparent they were all a variation of slow to a degree. One day news broke that the father had been sexually molesting his 2 daughters, I think 17 and 13, for God knows how long. Guy was never formally convicted due to lack of evidence, so he remains an outsider and out of the town. I believe his kids were sent to CPS immediately. There was a similar story in my town. A man molested his 4 daughters as well as forcing them to watch him and their mom having sex. She knew all about it but said nothing. They all had a slight intellectual disability as well, ranging from the lower end of "normal" to an actual slight disability. Child services had been notified, but since they tell the family they are visiting beforehand, they always pretended everything was fine and nothing happened. It only got out when the youngest daughter, who was about 5 at the time, was at a friend's house and asked her and her mom if their first time hurt that much as well. I went to school with one of the older girls and she used to lie a lot and had to cover for her dad a lot as well. When she was about 12, she was out of school for a few days and had some weird cover story, but it later turned she was getting an abortion because her dad got her pregnant. Really fricked up story. Not in my city, but in my family, my great uncle Norm was a Vietnam veteran and he brought home a sweet Vietnamese wife. They were very happy for some time. He taught her English and she was very crafty. They had 2 sons that he loved very much. When the sons got older, she became jealous of how much time he spent with them and how much he loved them. She became mean and resentful, spiteful. He started finding old meat and bugs in his lunches, and when he started bringing his own lunches, she would stalk him at work and try to give him lunches she made. She started ripping apart the house for him to come home and clean up, and didn't feed her sons, even though she was the housewife. He filed for divorce, and when he left for work, after handing her the papers, she stabbed her sons to death, doused their bodies and herself in rubbing alcohol, and lit herself on fire. He was absolutely devastated. As a kid I wondered why he was such a zombie, and when I got older my father told me what happened to him. I would probably be an emotional husk too. Girl in my neighborhood was tied to a tree, raped by multiple boys, and left there overnight, completely naked, until one of the neighbors found her in the morning. No one talked about it. Nothing was ever done. When I was around 12, a local boy, who actually lived across the street from me, was accidentally shot by his best friend. Apparently they had took the guns out of the house when they weren't allowed to and were shooting rattlesnakes in the ditch. However, one bullet ricocheted off a tree and hit the boy point blank in the face. He hung on for about a week before they took him off life support. However, I did hear my parents say years later that it might not have been an accident, which doesn't really make sense to me because the boys were around 11 years old at the time. I know people have murdered other people at younger ages, it just seems unlikely to me that that happened. In my hometown there was a girl who hid her pregnancy from everyone. She gave birth in her family home while everyone was out, but hemorrhaged and fainted. Her dad found her and took her to hospital where they proceeded to ask him where the baby was. He didn't know she was pregnant, but went back to the house to find the baby. He found the baby in a bucket in the cupboard. She had stabbed it multiple times with manicure scissors. She claimed it was dead on delivery, but the autopsy proved otherwise. She was arrested and spent a few months in a mental institution before being released back to my hometown. A decently popular Chinese restaurant in town had one of the owner's babies walk out the back door and disappear. It was freaking heartbreaking. The parents on TV and all in the paper. There was a big search effort. Eventually they found the baby's body stuffed into one of the cabinets at the restaurant. Pretty sure the place is still open. The mother had beaten the baby to death. I looked into it. She's serving 22 years and being deported. The place is closed. I live in a small town in the middle of a few small farms. One of the farms has a sort of greenhouse flower shop. One of the owner's sons committed suicide in the greenhouse. Later that year the father went into a field just outside of town and shot himself. His body was found by some kids going to school. Nobody talked about it. Edit. Wow, I never expected this to get this much attention. I'm actually from Canada in a very small town. Only about 700 to 800 people. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everything about everyone even without people really talking about it outside of their own homes. Hence how I found out. The screenshot of Belle Plaine is interesting because I live near a town called Belle Plaine, but I'm not the same one. It's crazy how many similar stories there are. If you'd like any other information I'd be happy to answer. Recently divorced father went to ex-wife's house, killed her and her new boyfriend, then shot himself, all in front of his kids. Also, another guy kidnapped a girl, killed her, raped her dead body, then chopped her up, and dumped the remains. Edit. This is two separate people. Copied from a previous post I replied to. Most depressing story time ever. One of the biggest and most notorious cases to hit my county was when two teenage girls were hit and killed by a driver who fled the scene. This post reminded me of this story because one of the girls had parts of the driver's license plate imprinted on the backs of her thighs. That's how hard she was hit. The driver was drunk, went home after the crash, asked her son to hide the vehicle, but first he needed to crash it into a pole to create some damage to cover up the hit and run damage. The kicker? The girl who had the license plate partially imprinted on her thighs was the daughter of the drunk driver. The driver hit her 14-year-old daughter and her best friend and left them to die in the streets. I don't think she knew who the girls were when she hit and ran, but damn. She got 8 years. Also, I live in weed country in NorCal, and we have a lot of locals and non-locals who flock to our remote and rural hills to trim weed on the black market. We have an epidemic of missing and murdered women, including indigenous women, and most of those murders simply go unsolved. It's pretty terrifying. Edit. Wow, I posted this at 3 AM last night and just came back to see the response. My inbox. Thanks for silver, kind stranger. My dad getting arrested for child abuse was the giant scandal. Pretty much everyone was supportive for the most part, which I don't hear a lot of for small towns. Landlord went easy on my brother for rent until he got situated. People would periodically bring food to check on us, and it never felt like gossip. Reckon. A friend of mine was seeing the local pastor for marriage counseling to try and save her marriage. A few months later the pastor up and moved without notice. The whole town was abuzz with gossip. Turns out she was sleeping with the pastor, and when his wife found out he had to move to save his marriage. May we live in interesting times. So this guy's girlfriend found out that he was going back to his home country to get married. She goes into a fit of rage and ends up murdering him, loads his body into a blender, cooks up a meal, and serves it to construction workers, and fed the remains to neighborhood dogs. Dead guy's brother is concerned, so visits girlfriend and finds a tooth in the blender and suspects a murder, thus alerting the police. She was arrested. The town pastor was allegedly touching the altar children, both boys and girls. It was freaked up because apparently some of the kids told their parents about it, but the parents either didn't believe them or didn't care enough to stop this from happening. So this went on for a while, and less people went to church except for the hardcore devotees, which were usually the parents of the children. So until those kids grew up they were forced to be sexually abused by their parents, and no adult did anything about it, and I believe the same pastor is still there to this day. My small town in Pembrokeshire, Wales was frequently used to dump pedophiles, gang members / and other troubled people from across the UK. Didn't know about this until I had left. Always wondered why it was flooded with heroin. Small village in England. A guy was being evicted from his home as he couldn't afford to keep up the payments. He was mentally unstable. There was a big standoff between him and the fire/policemen as he was threatening to burn himself alive in the house. I think it ended in him trying to light himself on fire and failed. Then someone snuck in through the back door and tackled him to the ground. Edit, a word. Not necessarily dark, mostly just weird, but we had a guy who got busted freaking the ducks he had on his farm. One of my primary school teachers was great. On the way home one night, everyone knew. Nothing was said. As a kid, disgustingly, we all knew her from that point as a bad lady. Out the back of my house was a suicide hotspot. 202 confirmed suicides, including parents with children. Everybody knows somebody that has jumped, but locally it's a taboo subject. In the small town I live in northern NB, 2 small boys were strangled in their sleep by a snake. The man who owned the reptile store had an undocumented python upstairs that was about 6 feet. His kids spent the night, and it had gotten out of its enclosure, which was way too small and not secured properly. I don't remember what happened to him. If you want to know more, look up Reptile Ocean Campbellton. I'm in band. My school used to do this thing called winter percussion. It's like winter guard, but with drums. One of the male instructors molested a 15 to 16 Y/O female student. Maybe great her IDK, but there were pieces of carpet taken for the trial throughout the back band rooms. You could go in there and still see the pieces of carpet missing, and we don't have a winter percussion anymore. Read it, words, and I'm from Indiana. Ugh, I have one. It's my neighbor town, but it's very small and just a few minutes by car from my hometown. There was a father who killed his 3 children with a hammer. It was pretty brutal for a town where nothing ever happened. Afterwards he tried to kill himself but failed. I think he was doing it out of revenge because his wife divorced him, and the kids were just there over the weekend. Also, many of my friends lived right next to this incident. We strangely never really talked about it. It died down pretty quickly and was never mentioned again. Used to live in a small town in the middle of nowhere in Western Australia. The town itself had a lot of weird things going on, but a house up the road from mine went up in flames. Turns out that house was a meth lab. All the remains of the house were still there last time I went there. Edit, for everyone asking what town it was in Esperance. There was a giant monster who used to kidnap and rape children and is now infamous internationally for his crimes. This man used to live near my town, where he abducted several children and teenage girls. He used to hide some of his victims in his cellar. During their captivity, some of the girls used pencils and sheets of paper to document their time in captivity. It is an atrocious read because of how graphic it is. Presumably, nobody speaks about him and his victims due to how horrendous the circumstances are, especially considering how he lived so close to the community. I even used to play on the same street where he buried several of his victims. Edit, rewrote by kind person as English is not my native language. My wife grew up very near Noble Gown Incorporated, where the Tree State Crematory event came to light in 2002. The incinerator broke, and the operator apparently was just tossing bodies in the backyard, kind of junkyard. in cars, under lawn clippings, partly buried, in between trees, etc. The town found out because multiple dogs brought home body parts. An 18-year-old boy and a 22-year-old girl had been dating for about a year and a half. She got pregnant and decided she wanted to get married. He made himself a little scarce for a while and pretty well ghosted her, so she wrote a letter to his parents explaining the situation. A few weeks later she gets a letter from him telling her to burn all their letters and meet him at midnight and they'll elope. She does as he says except for burning the letter telling her to meet him. Her brother went to see the boy. He says that he gave her $50 and put her on the train to the big city. Her father goes to see him at college the next month. He repeats the story about putting her on a train, but says give him a few days, he'll bring her home. The boy writes a letter home saying they won't see him again, but they keep quiet about it. Several weeks later her father rushes into the local telegraph office all worked up. He's seen his daughter in a dream, badly beaten, lying face down in a shallow grave. They get a search party together, swear out a warrant for the boy's arrest on suspicion of murder, and start looking. After a couple days of searching somebody kicks aside a cloud of dirt in the woods on the boy's uncle's farm, roughly half a mile from his house, and finds the heel of the girl's boot. Beaten to death, buried face down in a shallow grave, 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. She had put the letter saying they would elope in the front of her dress, along with another letter that was damaged beyond legibility. The boy was never caught. People do still talk about it. I didn't realize until a few weeks ago that the nice neighbor lady who used to give us the clothes that her sons had outgrown is the niece of the murderer and living on the farm that he grew up on. Looking back at the old, wanted posters, there's more than a passing resemblance between the murderer and her oldest son, 70 years age difference though, just a family resemblance. Dated a girl from a tiny mountain town. Her mom got more or less run out of their town because she had been just leaving her family for a few days at a time banging random people, and she was also linked to a couple pharmaceutical robberies in the area. Also had multiple credit cards maximumed out in her kids that were all like 5 to 10 years old. So what's a girl to do in that situation? Move the next town over and become mayor. When I was in 4th grade, a woman in her mid-20s was murdered by her friend who apparently had had a crush on her. He was in a kinda popular local metal band. He strangled her to death in his apartment, cut her head off with a machete, undressed her except for her boots, and posed a headless body in a pornographic way. He took multiple pictures in different poses, as well as a few close-up pictures of her head, and uploaded them to a gore website. When the moderators contacted him, he panicked, took down the post, set fire to his apartment, took her head, and killed himself by driving into a truck at full speed. There was a small article about it in the local newspaper, but after a few days no one mentioned it anymore. I assume out of respect for the family. I only found out the true scope of what had happened when I became friends with the younger sister when I was in high school. Horrifically, to this day, when you Google image search the deceased's name, the pictures that man posted are the very first things to turn up. They are spread across countless international gore websites, and the family can't do anything about it. Disclaimer in case anyone wants to ask for the name, I won't post it here, nor will I DM it. If that means you don't believe it, okay, but her dignity is more important than that. To give you some context, I'm from India, and this happened way back when I wasn't even born, and was told to me by my parents. It's not really a secluded town, rather my ancestral village, which is very small with a population of around 2,000 to 3,000. Back in those days, dacoits were a real menace in villages of North India. They had a very distinct way of looting. They would drop a letter a day before the loot that they're coming, be prepared, bringing in police for help, or leaving the village wouldn't have worked as the police used to get their own commission out of the loot. Only option yowd was to either surrender everything precious or die at their hands. This time however, they chose the wrong family to mess up with. It was the richest family in the village with just too many people. Considering the threat, they planned a counterattack. When the night came, and those 9 to 10 dacoits arrived on their horses with their guns, they found the house completely empty. As they started going through the rooms to search for any valuables, they were suddenly surrounded by a group of 80 to 100 people with machetes and stones and sticks and knife and anything they could find. They started beating the hell out of those 9 to 10 dacoits by first throwing stones at them, so they dropped their weapons, and then stabbing. Even the sweet old grandma was smashing heads that day. After killing all those dacoits, they buried their bodies in those vast fields. No one outside of that little village ever even heard about this event. I think that's a pretty well guarded secret.